when it is misused. It causes such a waste of time within teams because everyone has to click through useless back and forth messages when the topic doesn't really apply to them. In this video, we'll go over how to properly use reply all by covering 4 tips that you should follow to make life easier for you and everyone on your team. So the first tip is to apply the golden rule of reply all. And the golden rule states, don't use reply all when only the original sender needs to read your message. It's as simple as that. So if you're answering a question, responding with a courtesy phrase, or sharing a problem that only applies to you, then don't reply all, and instead unicast your note back to the sender themselves. And some phrases that are major offenders of reply all include congrats, thank you, I agree, please remove me from this mailing list, and my favorite, please stop replying all to this thread. And if you think about it, simple words like congratulations or thank you or agree don't really need to have everyone copied on the original email, and you can simply send the note back to the original sender alone. The second tip is to mention when you're removing members from the reply all list. So in situations when you want to reply back but only include a subset of the original reply all list, then you should clearly state whom you're removing and why to make things clear to your team. So one example is removing Jim and Tyler so I don't clog their inbox. Another example is removing the customer for confidentiality. And make sure you state the phrase at the beginning of your email message so that it's not missed. So if you write that 2 or 3 paragraphs down, then someone's going to miss seeing that and assume that everyone was originally copied. Now, as a side note, for sensitive emails, you can also modify the subject line with a qualifier like removing client or removing customer or for your eyes only. The third tip is to send a follow-up reply email after any offline discussions. And to help explain that, let me give you an example of what typically happens in a reply all email chain. So let's say John sends an email to the team about a certain topic. And then what happens is that Lisa reads the email and replies back to the team, copying John as well. And then a day or so later, Chris reads the email and also does the same and replies all. And then let's say some time passes, maybe a day or 2, and then what happens is that Lisa decides to give John a call and they have a phone conversation about the topic and they make an important decision about the topic itself without anyone being privy to it. Now the problem is that neither John nor Lisa send a follow-up email to the threads explaining that they talked and made that decision, and this leaves the entire team uninformed about what actually happened. And this is a cause of frustration and miscommunication among a team, especially when everyone finds out that the subject had been discussed and decided upon. So a best practice here is to summarize any offline discussions and proactively send a follow-up reply all email to close the loop on a particular topic. So an example would be a simple email from John saying, team, Lisa and I talked about this on the phone and decided that we will postpone our on-site visit until we hear back from the client. No further action is needed at this time. It's as simple as that. And then finally, tip number 4 is to state what you want the recipients to do. So you want to explicitly state what you want your email recipients to do. So if you don't want them to reply all to your message, then simply mention that at the end of your email. And here's an example. Please unicast your responses to me and don't reply all. And if you do want your team to reply all so that everyone is informed of the responses, then type that as well. So an example would be, please reply all to this email because it's an important topic and everyone needs to weigh in on it. Again, the idea is to explain exactly what you want them to do or not do. All right, let's wrap up with a quick summary. So the first tip is to apply the golden rule, which is don't use reply all when only the original sender needs to read your message. Tip number 2 is to mention when you're removing members from the reply all list. Tip number 3 is to send a follow-up reply email after any offline discussions. And tip 4 is to state what you want the recipients to do or not do. Thanks so much for watching, and on to the next video. In this video, we'll talk about how and why you should reply to questions in line in your email messages. So first, let's start with why reply in line. Replying in line means answering any questions in emails immediately after the questions themselves instead of answering them all at the top of your message. And writing out your answers in line helps improve readability and maintain the easy on the eyes factor. And in the next few slides, we'll cover 3 tips about how to accomplish that. The first tip is to use a different color font. So make your answers stand out by using a different color font. Choose a darker colored font such as blue instead of a lighter one such as yellow, because the latter is harder to see on a white background. And case in point, you see that the word yellow there is harder to read than the word blue, which are listed in the same colors. And you can also use bold fonts for your answers if you prefer that. The whole idea is to improve readability. So if you think you should use a combination of both, that's okay as well, meaning bold fonts and changing the color to make them stand out. However, as a side note, if you do use different color fonts, make sure that your recipients are not colorblind first. So let's look at an example. Let's say Susan sends me a following email asking me some questions about what hotel are we staying at in Miami, what charge code should we use, and whether we're renting a car or taking a cab. And the way I'd respond is simply, Susan, answers are in line below in blue. And I reference the answers in which I give her in blue below with each of the answers right after the question. And that way it makes it easy for Susan to pick out the answers and responses to each question while maintaining an easy on the eyes factor. Alright, the second tip is to copy the original questions in your reply. So a best practice is to copy the entire list of questions from the original email, paste them in your own email message, and then answer them. And this gives you a couple of advantages. The first is that you keep things clean, where your reply is not intermingled with their message. And the second is that when you forward your email thread or refer to it at a later date, everyone can easily pick out who answered what and when. Now, just to point out, this is really an optional best practice, and you only really need to do that if you have a lot of people copied on an email thread, or you think you need to maintain some sort of an audit trail. So let's use the previous example and modify it a little bit. So let's say Susan sends the exact same email with the questions and bullet points here below. My response would be to answer her questions by copying all 3 bullets into my original email and then answering them in line right after the questions. And in this case, the difference is that you're maintaining readability in case this email gets forwarded, and any timestamps that show up from an audit trail perspective can be easily picked out. The third tip is that if the questions were not separated out, then do that yourself. So if someone sends you an email with a bunch of questions that are all jumbled together in a paragraph, then separate the questions out for them. And this makes it easier for you to answer the questions, and it also forces your reader to look at their own questions and reread them as well. So the whole point is to improve communication with your team, and by doing that, you'll give your reader a chance to reread those questions and figure out if they need to add any more clarifying comments on them. And using the same example but modifying a little bit, let's say Susan's original email did not call out or separate out those questions, but she did have them baked into the paragraphs with one question here, one question there, and a third there. What I do at the top is separate those questions out for her in 3 different bullet points and then answer them in line. So again, what I'm doing here is I'm doing Susan a favor of listing out what her questions were and making it easier on me as well to answer those questions in line without adding any more confusion to the mix. All right, wrapping up with a quick summary. So tip number 1 is to reply to questions in line using a different color font or a bold font. Tip number 2 is to copy the original questions in your reply. Again, this is optional, but highly recommended. And then tip number 3 is that if the questions were not separated out, then do that yourself. Thanks so much for watching. On to the next video. When you receive an urgent or time-sensitive email from a team member, it's a good practice to reply directly after you've read it. In this video, we'll cover a couple of tips about how to reply immediately to time-sensitive emails. So let's start with why reply immediately. Replying immediately to sensitive messages acknowledges that you got the message and helps calm your team members down and manage expectations. Now, most people don't know how to interpret silence and wonder about questions like, did they get my message? Are they working on it? Did they overlook it? Did they know it's a priority? So make sure you reduce their stress by acknowledging their emails. For example, if you receive an email stating, hey, I really need this completed within the next 3 hours, and you can actually get it done, then instead of just working on the task for the next 3 hours and then emailing them when you're done, it's better to immediately reply and say something like, got it, and we'll work on it right away. So let's talk about a couple of tips about how to reply immediately. The first tip is to make sure that the acknowledgement is meaningful. So don't reply with just an okay unless it makes sense. Now, if your okay is a quick answer to a question or a simple acknowledgement, then that's totally fine. However, if you get an email with 4 actions and 7 questions, then an okay becomes meaningless and misleading. So make sure you add more info to your acknowledgement. And here are a few examples. Okay, I'll get this done by 2:30 p.m. Central Time today. Sure, I'll reply back to your questions before our deadline. Will do. I'll forward the attachment in the next 2 hours when I'm back at my desk. And finally, acknowledged, I will try my best, but no promises. And notice that those are very quick and short acknowledgements that you reply back to your recipient with, and you manage their expectations about whether you can get it done or that you'll try your best, but you can't give out any promises. The second tip is to spell out your need for an acknowledgement yourself. So if you're the one sending a time-sensitive email and you want people to acknowledge that they received it, then simply state that out clearly for them at the end of your email. And here are a couple of examples. Please confirm that you received this email and that you'll get this done. Or kindly let me know that you read this message as soon as you get it. So you're basically managing expectations on your behalf so that people respond back to you with some sort of an acknowledgement that they got the email. And that's it. Let's wrap up with a quick summary. Reply immediately to time-sensitive emails to manage people's expectations and calm them down. The first tip is to make sure that the acknowledgement is meaningful. And then tip number 2 is to spell out your need for an acknowledgement as well. And that's it. Thanks for watching. On to the next video. In this video, we'll discuss how and why you should read the latest email on a thread before responding back. So let's start out with a problem. Now, most people respond to emails from the bottom up of their inbox, and this means that they'll respond to emails in the order in which they were received. Now, the problem with that approach is that they might be responding to older messages, and the conversation could have moved on with multiple replies to the same subject. So a response could be based on outdated information because some newer messages were left unopened. And a very simple solution is to delay replying until you make sure that you've read all the unopened emails about a specific subject. So let's look at a typical email inbox. You've got the from field, the subject, and the date. And what usually happens is that people read their email from the bottom up. So they start by reading the email at the bottom, and then the next one after that, and then after that, and responding to each as they go along. Now the problem is when they want to respond to an email such as this one here, fiber optics cable issue, they wouldn't notice that it's also scattered all throughout their inbox, and they might be replying to outdated information. And a quick visual here shows you the same subject that is scattered throughout their inbox. And typically what they need to do is respond back to this latest one here on the 8th of March instead of the 7th here at the bottom, so that they make sure that they are responding back to the latest conversation and decisions that are made. So let me show you how you can easily start sorting those out. The first step is to sort your messages by subject. Now, if your inbox is quite full and you cannot easily spot all the messages about a specific subject, then you can sort your emails by subject line. And this makes it quicker to see an email thread because the messages will be stacked on top of each other. So going back to our previous example, usually what you can do is that you click on this header over here by hitting the subject column. And what happens is that once you click it, you'll notice usually a small little triangle that indicates that you have sorted things by subject. And you'll see here that all these subject lines that are similar are stacked right on top of each other. And you'll notice here that our topic of interest, the fiber optics cable issue subject line, is all clumped together, and you can tell from the dates what came in when, and you can simply just read through every single message and then reply to the latest one over here. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is using something called conversation threading. Now, some email programs have a feature called conversation threading where messages with the same subject line are visually grouped together. Now, you can turn that feature on, so it is optional, and view all your related emails in one thread as well. Let me show you how this works. So if you're using Outlook, the way you can turn this feature on is to go to the ribbon at the top, click on the View tab, and then where it says Show as Conversations, just make sure that you have that checked off. And if you're using Gmail, where you go is to settings at the top, and then make sure you are on the general tab. And then right there at the bottom, make sure that you have the conversation view selected to be on using the radio button. And to show you how this looks like using the previous example, you'll notice that the number of line items has significantly reduced. And the way you'll read this is if you look at this subject here, fiber optics cable issue, you'll notice some of the people who have responded to this email. So Steve, Jason, and Michelle. And then the ... just indicates that there are more people than just those three. And then this number in parentheses basically lets you know that there are 5 different emails about this specific subject line. And then the date over here indicates when that last email came in about the subject. And again, this just makes things in life a little bit easier where you see everything visually clumped together and you can run through the emails and read through the messages before replying back. Alright, so that was the first tip. The second tip is that if you make a mistake, correct it by replying back to the team. So if you make a mistake and reply to an outdated email, then do everyone a favor and immediately respond with a clarification. Now, a good practice is to reply all, acknowledge that your previous reply was incorrect, and explain what your updated reply is. And you need to do that because sometimes your readers don't even realize that you replied to an outdated email. So a simple example here is, team, I'm sorry, I just noticed I replied back to an email that was not the latest one on the thread. Based on the most recent information, I agree that we should set up a meeting to discuss. Alright, so that's it. Let's wrap up with a quick summary. Read the latest email on a thread before responding. The first tip is to sort your messages by subject or use conversation threading. And the second tip is that if you make a mistake, correct it by replying back to the team. And that's